The sun bled crimson across the western sky, painting the endless grasslands in shades of rust and shadow. Smoke rose in thick, choking plumes from what remained of a freight wagon, its charred skeleton listing sideways in a dry creek bed, where gray stones glinted like broken teeth. The air tasted of ash and burning pitch, acrid enough to make eyes water. Rosalind Fairchild fought like a cornered wildcat. In the grip of arms, she did not know her torn calico dress, whipping against legs that kicked at empty air. Her canvas lace-up shoes, worn thin from weeks of rattling stage travel, found no purchase against the man who held her. Terror clawed at her ribs, stealing her breath. "You monster," she screamed, voice ragged with fear and fury. "Let me go! Let me go!" The man who carried her moved with liquid grace, his stride never breaking despite her struggles. Dakota's buckskin shirt, soft from years of use, pressed against her spine as he pivoted sharply to the left. The single eagle feather woven into his dark braid swung with emotion. His face remained calm, jaw set, firm black eyes scanning the smoke-filled distance with the focus of a hawk. "I'm saving you," he said, his voice low and steady as river stones. A rifle shot cracked through the twilight. The bullet hissed past close enough that Rosalind felt its heat kiss her cheek. Dakota twisted, shielding her body with his own broader frame, and ran low through grass that reached his waist. Wild mustangs scattered in every direction, their panicked hoofbeats a drumming thunder that drowned out her protests. Rosalind's fingers clutched desperately at his beaded vest, grabbing at the leather ties, without conscious thought, her mind a storm of confusion and raw instinct. She felt the hard muscles of his chest contract with each powerful stride. Felt the sudden violent jerk as a second bullet tore through leather and grazed his left shoulder. Blood bloomed dark against the buckskin, He made no sound. He only tightened his arms around her ribs and ran faster, boots eating up ground. The horizon burned like a forge fire, crimson bleeding into deep amber where the sun touched earth. Ahead, the shallow white river caught the last light, a ribbon of silver, threading between muddy banks. Beside it lay a massive cottonwood log, stripped bare and bleached bone-white by countless seasons. Dakota dove behind it, landing hard on one knee, while still cradling Rosalind against his chest. Blood seeped through the torn shoulder of his shirt, spreading dark and wet. His breathing came fast, but controlled, measured. Behind them, voices rose rough from the smoke. Boots crunched on creek gravel. Another shot rang out, splintering bark from the log and showering them with pale wood chips. Rosalind's heart hammered so violently she thought her ribs might crack. She stared up at the face of the man holding her, the face she had been taught since childhood to fear, and saw only grim determination and the faintest shadow of pain he refused to acknowledge. "Who are you?" she whispered, throat tight. He met her gaze directly. "Someone who knows what they were about to do to you." The words sent ice through her veins, because somewhere deep in her bones she knew he spoke the truth. The white river ran shallow over smooth river stones, barely deeper than a man's knee this late in the season. Dakota crouched low behind the pile of driftwood where they had taken shelter, his breathing controlled, despite the blood seeping steadily through his torn shirt. The bullet had carved a furrow across his left shoulder, not deep, but painful and still bleeding. Rosalind's hands trembled violently as she pressed the strip of cloth he had torn from his sleeve against the wound. The fabric darkened immediately, soaking through warm and wet. This close, she could see details she had missed before: the fine laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, the strong line of his jaw, the methodical way he scanned the riverbank for movement, reading the land like other men read newspapers. "Why?" she whispered, voice hoarse from screaming. "Why help me?" He turned his head, meeting her gaze directly. His eyes were black as polished river stones, and utterly calm despite the blood and danger. "Because I know what they do. Pikes ring ships women east like cattle to slaughter. Some never reach their destinations. Those that do. He let the sentence hang unfinished but clear. Pike. The name struck Rosalind like a physical blow, bringing memories flooding back that morning at the coach stop in White River. The narrow man with thinning hair, slicked flat with pomade, and eyes the pale, lifeless color of dirty dishwater. His damp handshake. His promise of a respectable marriage placement with a rancher of good moral character. She had been so desperate. No family remaining in Ohio consumption had stolen her mother. 2 winters passed. Her father drowned in a mill accident 3 years before that. The newspaper advertisement had been her last hope, her only chance. But the boarding house had felt wrong from the moment she arrived. The stale air, Pike's lingering stares, the way the other men wouldn't meet her eyes at supper. "I found a ledger," Rosalind said, her voice breaking. "Last night, in Pike's office, names and payment amounts. I didn't understand what it meant until..." She swallowed hard. "They dragged me from the boarding house, put me in a wagon. One of them had an iron in the fire, said something about marking property." Dakota's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping. "You were lucky. My sister Ayanna, she watches the town, sells beadwork near the telegraph office. She saw them take you, found me at our camp, and told me which direction the wagon went. If she hadn't been watching, I owe her my life," Rosalind whispered. Then she reached into her soaked bodice with numb fingers and pulled out the ledger, its pages damp and rippled, but miraculously still legible. "I grabbed this before they caught me. Evidence. Columns of names and dates. Some crossed out in black ink." Dakota took the book carefully, his expression darkening as he flipped through water-stained pages. "This is more than evidence. This is enough to hang them all." He looked at her with something like respect. "You stole this knowing what it would cost you if they found it. Someone had to." She thought of those crossed-out names, women who had run out of time. How many others has he done this to? Too many. There's a deputy U.S. Marshal stationed at Fort Pierre, 2 hard days' ride northeast. If we can reach him with this proof, then we have to try. Rosalind clutched her arms around herself, suddenly shaking. Those women, all those crossed-out names, someone has to stop this. Dakota studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. Then he gave a single, sharp nod. "There's a telegraph station at Sagebrush, half a night's walk. A schoolteacher named Hazel Reeves sometimes stays there. She might help us. But we'll have to move at night, stay low. Can you ride a horse?" "I grew up on a farm," Rosalind said, lifting her chin despite her exhaustion. "I can ride well enough." "Good. Then we move now before they bring tracking dogs." He rose in one fluid motion and offered his good hand. Rosalind took it, feeling the calloused strength of his grip as he pulled her to her feet. A bullet chipped the log above their heads, spraying splinters. "Run," Dakota said, and they did. Night fell across the prairie like a heavy wool blanket, smothering the last traces of daylight. Stars emerged one by one, cold and impossibly distant. Coyotes began their evening song in the hills, voices rising and falling in eerie harmonies that raised the hair on Rosalind's neck. Dakota moved through the waist-high grass with barely a whisper of sound. Rosalind followed as best she could, stumbling over hidden roots and rabbit holes. Her wet dress chafed with every step, raising blisters on her thighs. The canvas shoes she had thought so practical were wearing dangerously thin at the soles. After what felt like hours, Dakota stopped and dropped into a crouch. He opened a small leather pouch tied at his belt and pulled out strips of dried venison and a thin blanket rolled behind his pack. "Here." He held out the blanket. "You're shivering hard enough to rattle teeth." "What about you?" Rosalind asked, though her fingers were already reaching for the offered warmth. "Lakota learned to manage cold young. I'm fine." She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders gratefully. It smelled of wood smoke and leather, and something indefinably safe. She watched as Dakota examined her shoes in the starlight, his dark brows drawing together. "Metal eyelets," he said quietly. "They catch moonlight, shine like signal mirrors." He worked quickly, wrapping thin strips of rawhide around each brass eyelet with deft fingers. When he glanced up suddenly and caught her staring at his hands, heat flooded her cheeks, and she looked away quickly. They had covered barely half the distance when hoofbeats suddenly drummed through the night air, growing rapidly louder. Dakota froze mid-stride, head tilted, listening with absolute focus. Riders, 2 horses, coming fast from the northwest. His hand shot out, catching Rosalind's wrist, and he pulled her down hard into a shallow depression in the earth, an old bison wallow. The grass grew thick and tall around its rim. They pressed flat against the cool earth, Dakota's larger body covering Rosalind's, his palms settling gently over her mouth to prevent any involuntary sound. Lantern light swung through the darkness like a searching eye. 2 men on horseback approached at a walk, their mounts moving slow and deliberate, heads low as they followed tracks. Grinning Tom and Shorty. Dakota breathed directly into her ear, his voice barely louder than thought. "Bounty hunters. Sloan keeps them on retainer." They rode to within 10 feet of the wallow. Rosalind could hear every word they spoke, could smell the tobacco smoke clinging to their clothes. "Can't have gone far on foot," Tom said, his voice high and nasal. "Pike wants the girl back breathing, but he don't care much about condition." "What about the Indian?" Shorty asked, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Sloan says bring him too. Dead's just fine for that one." The lantern swung closer. Light played across the grass directly above them. Rosalind's heart hammered so violently she was certain they would hear it. Dakota's weight pressed her deep into the cool earth, his chest rising and falling steadily against her back. Then a new sound cut the night, a dry buzzing rattle that froze the blood in Rosalind's veins. A rattlesnake lay coiled less than 3 feet from her face, its diamond-patterned body as thick as her wrist, its wedge-shaped head raised in clear warning. The tail vibrated steadily, producing that terrible sound. Rosalind's breath stopped completely. Her vision narrowed to that single terrible point, the flat, pitiless eyes, the flickering, forked tongue. With agonizing slowness, Dakota reached for a stick half buried in the dirt beside them. He slid it forward, inch by careful inch, positioning it beneath the snake's raised head, then dragged the angry creature away. With movements so gradual, they seemed almost gentle. The snake hissed, but did not strike. Dakota released it into the deeper grass beyond the wallow, where it slithered away into darkness. The riders moved on their lantern light, gradually fading. Rosalind finally exhaled against Dakota's palm, a long, shuddering breath. He lifted his hand carefully, and she gulped air, trembling from head to foot. "You all right?" he whispered. She managed a jerky nod, not trusting her voice. Dakota shifted his weight, giving her space, but for a long moment neither of them moved. The warmth of his body lingered against hers, and Rosalind realized with strange clarity that she felt safer pressed into this muddy hollow with a man she barely knew than she had felt anywhere since leaving Ohio. "My father drowned," she heard herself whisper into the darkness. 3 years ago, mill accident. My mother never recovered from the grief. She wasted away slowly, and I watched her die by inches. Consumption took her last winter. I had no one left. Nothing left. That's why I came west. Dakota was quiet for several heartbeats. Then, My people were pushed north from the Black Hills after the government broke the treaty. Again. My mother died giving birth to Ayanna. My father was killed 2 years later in a dispute over horses shot in the back by a white rancher who claimed self-defense. The law believed him. He paused. We keep going. That's what survivors do. Understanding passed between them without need for more words. They were both survivors, both alone in ways that mattered. We should move, Lakota said finally. Dawn's not far off. Sagebrush Station huddled against the prairie like something trying not to be noticed, a squat building with a sod roof and a telegraph pole standing sentinel against the pre-dawn sky. A single window glowed with lamplight. When Lakota and Rosalind arrived exhausted and filthy, Hazel Reeves was already awake, frying cornmeal mush on a cast-iron stove. Hazel was a tall, angular woman in her mid-40s, her iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. She wore wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a sharp nose. When she saw Lakota half carrying Rosalind through the door, she set down her spatula with a clatter. What manner of trouble are you bringing to my doorstep, Lakota? The worst kind, he said grimly. Pike's trafficking ring. We have proof this time. Rosalind pulled the damp ledger from inside her dress and laid it on the rough plank table with trembling hands. Hazel sat down, heavily adjusted her spectacles, and began to read. With each page, she turned her jaw grew tighter. Sweet, merciful. She caught herself, then slammed a palm flat on the table. I knew Pike was rotten, but I had no hard evidence. Girls would come through on the eastbound stage and vanish before anyone could ask questions. She tapped the ledger. This is enough to see him hang. We need to get word to the Deputy U.S. Marshal at Fort Pierre, Lakota said. Hazel nodded sharply. I can wire him directly. But the telegraph operator here, fellow named Sykes, is one of Sloane's paid men. He reads every message and reports anything interesting. Then we need another way, said a new voice from the doorway. A wiry man with a pointed beard and bright, intelligent eyes stood framed against the growing dawn light. Xavier Lemaire, the line repairman, swept off his battered hat with a theatrical flourish. Madame Hazel, I could not help but overhear. I know every wire from here to Fort Pierre, and I know how to splice a hidden line that this Sykes will never detect. If the lady will write her message, I will send it at dawn when Monsieur Sykes is sleeping off his whiskey. Hazel gripped his thin shoulder hard. Xavier, if they catch you. Then I run very, very fast. He winked. I had much practice in Paris. While Xavier went to work, Hazel hid Rosalind and Lakota in the hayloft above the corral. The space smelled richly of dried grass and old leather. Rosalind sank onto a pile of hay, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Lakota sat across from her in the dim light, methodically cleaning his knife. The wound on his shoulder had crusted over with dried blood. Let me clean that properly, Rosalind said, reaching for the cloth. He hesitated, then handed it over without argument. She dampened it from his canteen and began cleaning the wound as gently as she could. He did not flinch, but she watched the muscles in his jaw tighten. Why do you do this? She asked quietly. Track Pike's operation, help strangers. You could stay safe. Lakota was silent for so long, she thought he would not answer. Then, last winter I was scouting with a friend, a man named Two Rivers. Good man. We came to a river ford ice just beginning to form. I thought the ice was too thin. Told him we should wait. He said we didn't have time, that his family was waiting. He crossed anyway. His voice went flat. Ice broke halfway. I pulled him out, but by the time we reached shelter, the cold had gone too deep. He died before morning. Died because I hesitated when it mattered, because I didn't insist strongly enough. Rosalind's hand stilled against his shoulder. That wasn't your fault. He made his own choice. Did he? Dakota met her eyes. Either way, he's dead and I'm alive. Ever since that night, I don't hesitate when someone needs help. I act. Simple as that. She understood then the calm she had seen in his eyes during the rescue, the readiness to move. He carried his guilt like a stone in his pocket, and this was how he tried to lighten the burden. Thank you, she said softly, for not hesitating with me. He nodded once, and the silence between them felt somehow less empty, warmer than before. Before dawn fully broke, they slipped out with Xavier's confident assurance that his message would reach the marshal by mid-morning. But Fort Pierre was 2 hard days' ride to the northeast, and even once the message arrived, the marshal would need time to gather his deputies. They had perhaps 3 days before help could arrive. Dakota laid out their options, scratching a rough map in the dirt. We can circle wide through Echo Canyon, adds nearly a full day, but avoids Sloan's fenced land. Or we cut straight through his barbed wire pastures to reach Dr. Edmund Keene's place. Edmund's cabin is a day closer, and his testimony about these missing women would carry weight with the marshal. Rosalind studied the rough map, thinking of those crossed-out names. Women who had run out of time. We go through the wire, she said firmly. Direct route. Every hour we wait could mean another woman disappears. Dakota looked at her for a long moment, something that might have been approval flickering in his dark eyes. Then we move fast and pray we move smart. They cut onto Sloan's grazing land, just after full dark the following night, when a fat moon hung low and bright. The barbed wire stretched in cruel geometric lines across the rolling prairie, each strand strung tight enough to hum in the wind. Dakota led the way, testing each strand carefully before they attempted to slip beneath. The wire was strung low and vicious, 3 strands with barbs every 6 inches. Keep as low as you can, Dakota whispered. Move steady, not fast, hand over hand, watching for barbs. He slipped under the first fence line smoothly, then reached back to guide Rosalind through. Take my hand, I'll steady you. She followed his instructions, heart hammering. The wire scraped across her back, catching in the fabric of her dress. A strand caught her hair, pulling painfully. Dakota's palm pressed warm and steady against her shoulder blade, anchoring her, and his other hand carefully unhooked her hair from the barb, his fingers gentle despite the urgency. At the 3rd fence line, one of the barbs caught Dakota's palm as he gripped the wire to hold it down for Rosalind. The sharp point drove deep, tearing skin. Blood welled dark and quick, but he made not a single sound. He simply wiped his bleeding hand on his trousers and kept moving forward. They reached a small seep pool where water collected in a natural depression ringed with willows, their leaves silver in the moonlight. Dakota knelt first, rinsing his torn palm, then moved aside so Rosalind could wash the grime and dried blood from her face and hands. Without speaking, Dakota pulled a length of prepared sinew from his belt pouch and deftly tied up the worst tear in her sleeve. The gesture was entirely practical. Torn fabric could catch on wire or brush, but Rosalind felt the weight of care behind it. She mattered to him. Then sharp and sudden, a bell clanged in the distance. Once, twice, 3 times. Dakota's head snapped up, his whole body going tense. Hell and damnation. Night herd. What's that mean? Rosalind asked, but the growing thunder answered before he could. Hoofbeats, hundreds of them. The ground itself began to tremble. Sloan's cowboys used night herds as a brutal method of flushing out trespassers, stampeding cattle through the darkness to trample anyone hiding in the grass. Run! Dakota shouted, grabbing her hand. Head for that ridge. They sprinted toward a low rise of broken rock jutting from the prairie like the spine of some ancient buried creature. The herd surged behind them, a living wave of muscle and horn and blind panic, the sound building to a roar that drowned out thought. Dust rose in choking clouds. Dakota shoved Rosalind up the rocky slope ahead of him, then whirled back, pulling a small torch from his belt and striking his flint to light it. The dried grass wrapped around the stick caught immediately, flaring bright. He waved the flame in wide, sweeping arcs, shouting wordlessly at the top of his lungs, driving the outer edge of the stampeding herd away from the ridge. The cattle veered and split, flowing around the rocky outcrop like water around a stone. But one massive bull broke through the gap. Head-lowered horns gleaming, charging straight at Dakota with single-minded fury. Dakota backpedaled fast, but his boot heel caught on a half-buried stone. He stumbled hard, going down on one knee. The bull bore down on him like a locomotive. Rosalind screamed and lunged down the slope, without thinking, without any plan, except that she would not watch him die. She grabbed his arm with both hands and hauled backward with every ounce of desperate strength her body possessed. The bull thundered past, so close, its flank actually brushed Dakota's shoulder, nearly spinning him around. The rush of displaced air hit them like a physical blow. They tumbled together up onto the ridge in a tangle of limbs and gasping breaths, rolling twice before coming to rest against a boulder. Dust filled the air so thick it was like breathing sand. The herd swept past below a river of cattle that seemed endless. When the worst had passed and the thunder began to fade, they lay pressed together on the rock hearts, hammering in unison, both stunned and alive. Dakota's eyes were wide, not with fear of the bull, but with something else entirely. "You pulled me up?" he said, his voice full of wonder. "You didn't have to." "Of course I did." Rosalind's hands were still gripping his vest. She realized it and let go quickly, heat flooding her face. "You'd have done the same. You have done the same. I had to save you, it was right. But you..." He seemed to struggle for words. "You chose to come back. No one's done that for me since his friend died." Rosalind understood. Since he had failed to save someone he cared about. She rolled onto her back beside him, staring up at the vast sweep of stars wheeling overhead. "We're alive," she said, and was surprised to hear herself half laughing, half sobbing. "We're actually still alive." "Yeah." Dakota sat up slowly, brushing dust from his hair. "We are." The words felt like a promise. Dr. Edmund Keene's cabin stood solid and square on the bank of Wolf Creek, built from pine logs, carefully chinked with clay against the winter winds. A painted wooden shingle hung from the porch beam. "Physician, all persons welcome." Smoke rose from the stone chimney in a steady column. Lamplight glowed warm in the windows. Dakota knocked 3 times in a specific pattern. The door opened immediately. Edmund was a stocky, barrel-chested man in his mid-50s, with gray whiskers and keen, intelligent eyes. He looked from Dakota to Rosalind, taking in their condition with a physician's rapid assessment, then stepped aside without a word. "Inside, quickly now." The cabin's interior smelled of carbolic acid, dried herbs, and beeswax. Edmund gestured them toward chairs near the fireplace and reached for his medical bag. He examined Dakota's shoulder wound, first cleaning it with stinging antiseptic, then turned his attention to Rosalind's temple. "Now," Edmund said, setting down his instruments, "what brings you to my door looking like you've been dragged behind horses?" Dakota handed him the ledger without preamble. "Read." Edmund sat at his desk, lit a second oil lamp, and began to read. His ruddy face gradually paled. His jaw set harder with each page. Finally, he looked up, and Rosalind saw anger burning in his eyes, the cold, controlled fury of a good man confronted with evil. "I kept notices," he said quietly. "Missing women. I posted queries to newspapers, sent telegrams to neighboring towns." He pulled a worn folder from his desk drawer and laid out yellowed newspaper clippings and telegraph bulletins. These names. They match your ledger. Rosalind leaned forward, scanning the notices. Sarah Henshaw disappeared, March 1871. Catherine Moore, last seen May 1871. Mary Collins vanished July 1871. Every name from Pike's crossed-out entries had a corresponding notice. I'll write a sworn affidavit. Edmund said, his voice steady with purpose. Medical testimony carries weight in territorial court. Take this to the marshal with my statement. It's enough to... The door burst open with a crash. Ayanna stumbled across the threshold, her neat braids disheveled, her lower lip split and bleeding. She clutched her side as though her ribs hurt. They know, she gasped, struggling for breath. Pike knows Rosalind escaped. He's riding here with the sheriff and half a dozen men. They'll be here within the hour. Edmund's face went slack with shock. The sheriff, John Daniels, is riding with Pike. They're partners. Ayanna's eyes were fierce despite her injuries. I've seen them meeting behind the saloon, late at night when they think no one's watching. But I watch. I always watch. She turned to Edmund. Remember last month, the sheriff came to you with his hand all torn up. Said it was a wagon accident, that some woman fought back and scratched him deep. Edmund nodded slowly. I stitched 4 deep scratches across his right hand, ring finger to wrist. Ice flooded through Rosalind's veins. She remembered that night at the boarding house, being dragged toward the wagon, fighting with desperate strength, her nails raking across someone's hand as he grabbed her. She had drawn blood. She remembered the warm slickness of it under her nails. It was him, she whispered. The sheriff tried to take me himself that night. He's one of them. Edmund cursed a short, vicious word. If Sheriff Daniels is Pike's partner, we can't trust any local authority. The deputy U.S. Marshal is our only hope. There's more, Ayanna said, her voice shaking now. Sloane's planning to open the main dam gates at midnight tonight. He's going to flood the Lower Valley farms. Says it's punishment for harboring thieves. But really, it's to drive people off their land. Yale Crawford's homestead is right in the flood path. His family they could drown if they're sleeping. Dakota stood abruptly, his face grim. How long do we have? 3 hours, maybe less. Rosalind looked from Dakota to Edmund to Ayanna. The weight of the choice pressed down on her like a physical burden. They could run now, take the ledger and Edmund's affidavit to the marshal, and let the law handle the rest. Save themselves. Or they could stay and fight. But she thought of those crossed-out names. Women who had run out of time. We stopped them, she said, her voice steady despite her fear. We stopped the flood first. The marshal can wait 1 more day. Edmund moved to a locked cabinet and pulled out a cap-and-ball revolver, checking the loaded chambers with practiced efficiency. Then you'll need this. It's loaded 6 shots. Make them count. He handed the weapon to Rosalind. The pistol was heavier than she had expected, cold iron solid in her palm. I'll teach you the basics, Dakota said. They went outside to the creek bank. Dakota stood close behind her, his chest against her back, his arms coming around to position her grip. Sight down the barrel, both eyes open. Breathe out slow and steady. Squeeze the trigger, don't jerk it. His breath was warm against her ear. She shivered despite the heat, intensely aware of his closeness, the solid strength of him. Try it, he said quietly. She aimed at a dead stump 20 feet away and fired. The recoil jolted through her shoulder. The shot went wide by 3 feet. Again, Dakota said. His hands adjusted her grip slightly, tilted the barrel down a fraction. Don't fight the kick. Let it happen. They fired until 5 of the 6 chambers were empty, and she could hit the stump 3 times out of 5 attempts. Lakota stepped back, and the sudden absence of his warmth felt like a loss. "You'll do," he said, and she heard approval in his voice. Rosalind tucked the heavy revolver into her belt. "What's our plan?" "We split our forces," Lakota said. "Ayanna rides back to Sagebrush Station with Hazel. They take Xavier and head for Fort Pierre to meet the marshal, personally bring him back with as many armed deputies as he can muster. The rest of us, Edmund, Yale, you and me, we go to the dam. We stop that flood however we can." Edmund nodded agreement. "Yale Crawford knows every inch of land around that reservoir. We'll need his help." They gathered supplies, quickly coils of rope, a heavy iron crowbar, a sharp pickaxe, Edmund's medical kit. Ayanna hugged her brother tightly before she left, whispering something in Lakota that Rosalind could not understand, but recognized as a prayer or blessing. Lakota touched his sister's bruised cheek gently, then let her go. As they prepared to leave, Rosalind caught Lakota's eye across the cabin. "If we don't make it back, we'll make it," he said firmly. But his hand found hers in the shadowed doorway, gripped tight for just a moment and squeezed. A promise, without words. But Edmund had one more revelation. As they were leaving, he stopped Lakota at the door. "You should know I'm not just a frontier physician. 10 years ago, I worked as an investigator for the Deputy U.S. Marshal's office. That's how I know what evidence will stand in court. That's why I keep those files." He gestured to the folder of missing person notices. "I gave it up after I lost someone to men like Pike. Thought I could save more lives with medicine than with law, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe it takes both." The revelation clicked pieces into place, the locked weapons cabinet, Edmund's immediate understanding of the ledger's significance, his network of contacts. "Does the current marshal know?" Lakota asked. "Not yet, but he will soon enough." They rode into danger with grim determination. Rosalind realized she had never felt more alive. Echo Canyon was a wound in the earth, a deep slash carved by ancient floods through layers of red sandstone and gold limestone that rose 100 feet on either side. The trail wound narrow and treacherous between stone faces that blocked the sky. The only sounds were boot leather scraping on rock, the distant cry of a hunting hawk, and the labored breathing of 4 people pushing themselves past exhaustion. Lakota led the way with the confident stride of someone who had traveled this path many times. Rosalind followed close behind, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall for balance. Behind them came Edmund and Yale Crawford, the farmer, a lean, sun-weathered man with hands scarred from decades of hard labor. They were halfway through the narrowest section when the rifle shot cracked the silence like breaking bone. The bullet struck the canyon wall inches from Rosalind's head, exploding stone into razor-sharp fragments that stung her cheek. She yelped and dove behind a boulder, heart hammering. Lakota was already moving his body low, scanning the canyon rim high above. "Ambush," he shouted. "Get to cover." 3 figures appeared on the western rim, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Roaring Jack, one of Sloane's hired guns, a massive man with a voice to match his name. Peg Leg, Pete the wagon driver, his wooden leg clearly visible. And a third man Rosalind didn't recognize, rifle already raised. They fired down into the canyon, bullets ricocheting off stone with whining screams that made Rosalind's ears ring. Chips of rock flew like shrapnel. "Split up," Lakota yelled over the gunfire. "Don't give them a grouped target." They scattered, pressing into narrow crevices and shallow overhangs. Another shot cracked out, and Yale Crawford cried out sharply, clutching his left side and staggering. Edmund was moving before the farmer hit the ground, dragging him behind a massive fallen boulder with surprising strength. Broken ribs, he called out. Maybe punctured lung. He can't go any farther. Dakota met Rosalind's eyes across the 30 feet of canyon floor that separated them. The message in his look was crystal clear, and they were on their own now. Just the two of them to stop the flood. "Stay with him," Dakota shouted to Edmund. "Keep him alive. We'll finish this." He gestured sharply to Rosalind, pointing to a treacherous scree chute that climbed the southern canyon wall, a steep slope of loose rock and scrub brush that looked barely climbable. It was their only way up. Bullets whined and sparked around them as they scrambled for the chute. Rosalind's boots slipped on loose stones, sending small avalanches rattling down. Her hands scrabbled for purchase. A bullet shattered rock beside her left hand, and she felt a sharp burning pain a rock chip had laid open her palm. Blood welling hot and quick. The cut on her temple, partially healed, tore open again from exertion. Blood trickled down her cheek, dripping from her jaw. Her vision blurred. Dakota was suddenly there, his strong hand clamping around her wrist, hauling her up when her strength faltered. "Stay with me," he said, and this time it was not a command, but a plea, raw and urgent. "Please, Rosalind, stay with me." The use of her name, the naked worry in his voice, gave her strength she did not know she had. She dug her feet in and climbed. They reached the canyon rim just as the sun touched the western horizon, spilling liquid gold across the prairie. The dam lay half a mile ahead, a massive structure of logs, packed earth and iron gates, holding back a reservoir that stretched nearly a mile long, glittering like hammered silver. But what froze them in place was the telegraph draft nailed to a weathered post near the dam's catwalk access. Dakota yanked it free and read aloud, his voice tight with controlled fury. "To Territorial Marshal Crow. Wing hostile Indian attack on White River. Dam request immediate military assistance. Sheriff John Daniels." The draft was dated tomorrow's date. Prepared in advance. Rosalind felt her stomach twist violently. "They're going to blow the dam and blame it on your people, on the Lakota. Use it as justification to drive them off their lands." Dakota crumpled the paper in his fist, his knuckles white. "Sloan's been planning this for months, maybe longer. Force the Lakota off Sorrow Hill, open up 10,000 acres for his ranching operation. He just needed the right excuse, the right villain. Then we stop him," Rosalind said, checking the revolver at her belt. "Whatever it takes. We stop this now." They moved toward the dam as darkness fell, and the stars began their cold watch overhead. Midnight wind howled across the reservoir, like the breath of something wild and angry, whipping the dark water into whitecaps that slapped and foamed against the dam's massive pilings. Storm clouds raced across the moon, alternately revealing and concealing the scene in pulses of silver light. Torches burned on the catwalk, spanning the dam's width, their flames streaming sideways, casting writhing shadows. Rosalind and Dakota crouched in the tall reed grass at the water's edge, watching. Cold mud soaked through Rosalind's skirts. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The revolver at her belt felt impossibly heavy. 4 men stood on the dam's iron catwalk, Blackjack Sloan Sheriff John Daniels, Grinning Tom, and another guard she didn't recognize. They were rigging dynamite primary blasting charge. Black powder used only as a primer to the secondary spillway gate, working methodically. Satchels of dynamite sticks with safety fuse. A small horn of black powder, only for priming. Fuse cords measured and cut. Sloan's voice carried across the water, full of satisfaction. "Once the dynamite blows the spillway," he was saying, "we open the main gates wide. Whole valley floods in under an hour. We blame the savages, show the marshal that forged telegraph, and by spring the territorial governor will have cleared every Lakota north of the Little Missouri. We'll own this entire watershed." Sheriff Daniels laughed, the sound ugly. Pike's already got buyers lined up for the land. We'll be rich men by Christmas. Rage burned hot in Rosalind's chest. Dakota's jaw was set so tight she could see the muscle jumping. We have to stop that dynamite. If it blows the spillway, the main gates won't matter. The dam fails and everything floods. How do we stop 4 armed men? Rosalind whispered. I'll take the far pier, come up from the water where they can't see. You go for the gate controls in that shack, see it. He pointed to a wooden structure at the south end. Jam the wheel mechanism any way you can. If they can't open the gates manually, we buy time. When you hear me shout, run for cover. Understood. What if? No what ifs. His eyes met hers in the darkness, fierce and certain. We do this. We save these people. That's all that matters. He stripped off his vest and knife belt, handing them to her, then slipped into the cold water without another word. The reservoir swallowed him silently. Rosalind watched the spot where he had disappeared, counting her own heartbeats. 10, 20, 30. He did not surface. She forced herself to move, crawling on her belly through the reeds, every sound magnified by fear. The catwalk loomed ahead, its planks wet and treacherous with spray. She reached the control shack and eased the door open with infinite care. The hinges creaked, a tiny sound that seemed loud as a scream. Inside, massive iron wheels controlled the sluice gates connected by heavy chains to the spillway below. Rosalind grabbed the crowbar from her belt and wedged it deep into the main wheel's spokes, hammering it home with the butt of the revolver. Metal shrieked in protest. What in blazes was that? Sloane's voice sharp and close. Footsteps pounded on the catwalk, running toward her position. Rosalind backed against the wall, raising the revolver with both shaking hands. The guard she had not seen before rounded the corner rifle, coming up. His eyes widened when he saw her, a muddy, bloodied woman in torn clothing, pointing a gun at his chest. Time seemed to slow. Rosalind saw his finger tighten on the trigger, heard Dakota's voice in her memory breathe out slow. Squeeze, don't jerk. She fired. The sound was deafening. The guard staggered backward, clutching his right arm where her bullet had torn through muscle. His rifle clattered to the planks. He fell hard, cursing, blood streaming between his fingers. Rosalind stared at what she had done at the blood, and for one terrible moment thought she would vomit. Then survival kicked in. She grabbed his rifle and slung it over her shoulder, then ran. On the far side of the dam, Dakota erupted from the water, like something elemental water streaming from his hair and clothes. His knife flashed as he cut the dynamite fuse cords one after another, working with desperate speed. But the 4th cord was already lit. Grinning Tom had struck a match during the chaos. The fuse burned steadily, sparking and smoking. 18 inches, 12 inches. Dakota grabbed the satchel, but his wet hand slipped. The bag tumbled, catching on a timber support beam, hanging precariously over the water. 6 inches of fuse left. He dove for it, his fingers closing around rough canvas, just as the fuse burned to 4 inches. With a roar of effort, he hurled the entire satchel out over the water, away from the dam structure. It exploded in midair with a deafening boom, a brilliant orange fireball that lit the night like dawn. The shockwave knocked Dakota off his feet, slamming him against the railing. Water geysered up, drenching the catwalk. But the dam itself held. The spillway gates remained intact. Sloane saw him and roared with rage. The big man charged along the narrow catwalk, drawing a pistol from his belt. Dakota met him head-on, and they grappled, 2 figures struggling on a platform 50 feet above, churning water, lit by wildly swinging torches. Rosalind ran toward them, but Sheriff Daniels blocked her path, moving faster than a man his size should. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back viciously. Pain exploded across her scalp. There's the little thief. He snarled, his face inches from hers. She could smell whiskey on his breath. Rosalind remembered Edmund's scalpel tucked into her sleeve in a leather sheath. Her fingers found it, pulled it free. She slashed upward with all her strength, opening a deep line across the sheriff's left cheek from ear to jaw. Blood poured instantly. He howled and fired his pistol. The bullet grazed her right boot, tearing leather and scoring across her ankle. White-hot pain. She kicked his knee with her other foot, driving her heel into the joint with every ounce of strength she possessed. Something crunched. He stumbled backward, and she shoved him hard into the railing. "The marshal is coming," a new voice shouted from the darkness. Rosalind spun. Hazel Reeves stood on the ridge above the dam, silhouetted against the sky, waving a telegram like a banner. Behind her, the deputy U.S. Marshal and 6 armed deputies rode hard down the slope, rifles glinting in the moonlight. "Xavier got the wire through," Hazel shouted. "Help is here." But Sloan was beyond reason now, beyond caring. His partnership was finished, his scheme exposed. If he could not have his empire, he would burn it all down. He broke free from Dakota with a savage headbutt that split Dakota's eyebrow, blood pouring into his eye. Sloan lunged for the main gate wheel. Rosalind's crowbar had jammed it, but Sloan was massive, powerful. He grabbed the iron spoke and wrenched with brutal force. The crowbar bent, groaning. Metal screamed. The wheel began to turn. "No!" Dakota tackled him from behind, driving him away from the mechanism. They crashed into the wooden railing. Old timber splintered, cracked. The railing gave way. Both men plunged toward the spillway grates below, iron bars designed to catch debris. Dakota caught the edge of the catwalk with one hand, his body swinging out over empty space. But Sloan wasn't as fortunate. He fell straight down, his scream cutting off abruptly as he hit the grates with bone-breaking force. The current dragged him sideways, wedged him between the iron bars. He thrashed once, twice, then went still. The water took him under. Rosalind ran to the broken railing and grabbed Dakota's wrist with both hands. "Hold on." His wet skin was slippery, his weight pulling her forward. She dug her heels in, leaning back with all her strength. His other hand clawed at the wet planks, found purchase on a metal bolt, and with a final desperate heave, he pulled himself up and over the edge, rolling onto the catwalk in a gasping heap. They lay side by side, chests heaving, while around them the marshal's deputies swarmed the platform, subduing Grinning Tom and Sheriff Daniels with brutal efficiency. Iron shackles snapped closed. The gates held. The crowbar, though bent, had done its job. The dam did not fail. The reservoir did not flood the valley. Above them, the storm clouds parted. Moonlight poured silver across the water. Dawn broke gray and cold over the White River Dam, and the storm having passed in the night. The wind had died completely, leaving the water mirror smooth and the air sharp with the smell of rain-washed sage. The deputy U.S. Marshal stood beside the control shack, reading the ledger by bright lantern light, his weathered face carved from stone. "This is enough to hang them all," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of law. "Trafficking, conspiracy, attempted murder, destruction of property. Pike, Sloan, Sheriff Daniels, they'll all answer for this." Dr. Edmund, who had arrived near dawn with Yale resting in the back of his buckboard, signed a detailed sworn affidavit attesting to the names in the ledger and their correlation with his missing person notices. Hazel and Xavier gave lengthy testimony about the telegraph tampering, presenting the physical evidence of Xavier's hidden wire splice. The sheriff's fresh scar, perfectly matching the scratches Rosalind had described, sealed his fate beyond any doubt. Sheriff John Daniels sat in iron shackles on the catwalk, his hands bound behind his back, silent and beaten. Sloan's body had been pulled from the spillway grates an hour before sunrise. Grinning Tom would face trial. The marshal had already dispatched deputies to White River with orders to arrest Walter Pike and any other Confederates they could identify from the ledger. The trafficking ring was broken, finished. Yale Crawford, his ribs tightly bound with bandages, crossed slowly to where Dakota sat on a boulder. His splinted left arm cradled against his chest. Broken in the fall, Edmund had determined, but cleanly set. "You saved my farm." Yale said, his voice rough with emotion. "My family, my children. I got 3 little ones who'd have drowned in their beds if that flood came." He shook Dakota's good hand carefully. "I won't forget this. Ever." He turned to Ayanna, who stood nearby with her split lip and bruised face. From his pocket, Yale pulled a small silver brooch shaped like a wild rose, tarnished but beautiful. "My wife's," he said softly. "She passed 2 years back. Would have wanted you to have it. For luck." Ayanna's dark eyes filled with tears. She hugged the farmer quickly but fiercely, then pinned the brooch carefully to her dress. Rosalind knelt beside Dakota with a bowl of clean water and strips of cloth Edmund had provided, washing away the blood and mud from his skin, working carefully around the splint. His face was a map of injuries split, eyebrow bruised, jaw, countless scrapes. But his eyes were clear and steady on hers. "You jumped in after me," he said quietly. "Into the water. You struggled against that current." "I swim well enough," Rosalind said, wringing out the cloth. "And I wasn't going to let you fall. Not after everything." "Why not?" His voice was barely a whisper. "You'd have been safer. Could have escaped while I was fighting Sloan." She paused, the cloth dripping in her hands, met his gaze directly. "Because you matter. To me. More than safety. More than anything." The words hung between them, simple and true and terrifying in their honesty. Dakota's good hand rose slowly, hesitantly, and cupped her cheek with infinite gentleness. His thumb brushed the bandage on her temple. "You're the bravest person I've ever known," he said. "Braver than any warrior I've ridden with." "So are you," she replied, and allowed herself to lean just slightly into his touch. They sat like that as the sun climbed higher, turning the prairie from gray to gold, while around them the business of justice moved forward with slow inevitability. 10 days later, the territorial court convened in the large barn at Widow's Peak. Townsfolk packed the benches. Farmers and ranchers, shopkeepers and freight drivers, Lakota families who had traveled from Sorrow Hill, all of them united in wanting to see justice done. The judge, a grim-faced man with silver hair, presided from behind a makeshift bench constructed of hay bales draped with an American flag. The testimony was devastating in its thoroughness. The marshal presented the ledger page by damning page. Hazel Reeves spoke with controlled fury about the girls who had vanished over 3 years. Dr. Edmund detailed the correlation between the ledger's crossed-out names and his missing person notices. Xavier Lemaire demonstrated with pieces of wire exactly how he had spliced the hidden telegraph line. These men, they think they can own everything, the water, the land, even the people. But they cannot own justice, none. Ayanna stood before the judge wearing the silver brooch Yale had given her. She presented a bundle of letters she had recovered from Pike's boarding house, coded correspondence detailing shipping routes, prices, and delivery schedules for goods. The paper edges were charred black, where Pike had tried to burn them as the marshal's men broke down his door. But Ayanna had pulled them from the flames. "I kept them safe," she said, her young voice clear and steady. "For all the girls who couldn't speak for themselves anymore." The judge ordered the White River Dam transferred to territorial control with water rights to be distributed fairly among valley farmers. Blackjack Sloan had already paid the ultimate price. Sheriff John Daniels and Walter Pike were sentenced to hang by the neck until dead, the sentence to be carried out within 30 days. Their Confederates received prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years hard labor. Justice swift and final and absolutely certain. But as the crowd began to disperse, the marshal approached Rosalind and Dakota With one more document, a telegram that had arrived that morning from the territorial capital. "You should read this," he said, handing it to Edmund. Edmund unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning quickly. Then his weathered face broke into something that might have been satisfaction. "Governor Marcus Whitfield has been arrested." Seems Pike's coded letters that Ayanna recovered included correspondence with the governor's office. He wasn't just aware of the trafficking ring, he was taking a percentage. 20% of every shipment Pike sent east went into Whitfield's accounts. Rosalind felt the breath leave her lungs. The governor, he was behind all of this. The territorial capital investigator found bank records, account books. Pike kept meticulous documentation of every payment, including those to Whitfield. The governor thought he was protected by his position. Edmund's smile was grim. He wasn't. They arrested him 3 days ago. He'll stand trial next month in federal court. The revelation settled over them like the final piece of a complex puzzle clicking into place. The trafficking ring hadn't just been a local operation, it had reached the highest levels of territorial government. But now, thanks to Ayanna's quick thinking in saving those letters, thanks to the ledger Rosalind had stolen, thanks to all their combined testimony, the entire network was exposed. Destroyed root and branch. "It's over," Rosalind whispered. "Really over?" "Yes," the marshal said. "The territorial prosecutor estimates at least 30 women will be located and freed from bondage in the next few months, thanks to the names and destinations in Pike's records. You saved them all. Every one of them." That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Rosalind stood at the White River ford, where she and Lakota had first hidden together. The water ran crystal clear over smooth stones, sparkling in the light. She had washed properly for the first time in weeks, borrowed a clean dress from Hazel, simple blue calico that felt like silk. Lakota approached slowly, his left arm still splinted, but healing well. He moved with quiet confidence, his presence as steady as the land itself. "What will you do now?" he asked, stopping beside her. Rosalind had thought about little else for days. Hazel had offered her a permanent position as assistant teacher at the new school they were building in White River. The territorial governor, the new one appointed after Whitfield's arrest, had promised a modest stipend in recognition of her testimony and courage. "I thought I might teach," she said, watching sunlight dance on water. "Help Hazel with the school. Maybe stay." She looked at him, heart pounding. "Would you? Would that be acceptable? If I stayed?" Something in Lakota's expression softened a tension she had not realized he carried easing from his shoulders. "I'd like that. Very much." "And you?" she asked. "What will you do?" "The marshal offered me a position. Deputy scout for the territory. Help track down the last members of Pike's network who might have scattered. Make sure no one tries to start this business again." He paused. "But the work would be based here in White River. I'd be home most nights. Close to Ayanna. Close to..." He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. "That sounds perfect," Rosalind said softly. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the river flow past, heading toward distant oceans. Then Hazel arrived breathless, with Ayanna beside her. The Territorial Assembly approved funding for the school. Hazel announced, her normally severe face split by a rare smile. "Full funding. 3 teachers including you, Rosalind. And they're sending textbooks. Real textbooks from Boston. We start classes in 3 weeks." Ayanna was bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement. "And they're accepting Lakota students. Any student who wants to attend. Dr. Edmund is setting up a scholarship fund for families who can't afford supplies." It was more than Rosalind had dared hope for. A real school. A real future. A chance to build something lasting in this harsh, beautiful land. As Hazel and Ayanna headed back toward town, chattering about curriculum and classroom arrangements, Rosalind and Dakota remained by the river. The sun painted the sky in shades of soft rose and purple gentler colors than the crimson blaze that had marked that first terrible evening. "I came here with nothing," Rosalind said quietly. "Desperate and alone and terrified. I thought I was looking for someone to save me, a husband, security, a place to belong." "And now?" Dakota asked. "Now I know I didn't need someone to save me. I needed to save myself, and to find people worth fighting beside." She turned to look at him fully. "I found that. I found you." Dakota's good hand rose slowly, settling warm against the small of her back. Not pulling her closer, just resting there. A touch that felt like a promise. "I came to White River tracking Pike's operation," he said. "Trying to save others because I couldn't save two rivers. Thought if I kept moving, kept fighting, the guilt would ease." He paused. But it wasn't about guilt. It was about finding something worth staying for. Someone worth staying for. "Did you find it?" Rosalind asked, though she already knew the answer from the way he was looking at her. "Yes," he said simply. "I did." They stood together as full night settled over the prairie, his hand warm against her back, her shoulder pressed against his chest. They did not speak of love. The word felt too small, too inadequate for what had grown between them through fire and water, through terror and triumph. They had saved each other's lives multiple times, had seen each other afraid and brave, weak and strong, determined and doubting. They knew each other's scars, visible and hidden. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. When dawn broke the next morning, washing the prairie in soft amber light, Rosalind walked with Dakota to the site where the new schoolhouse was being built. Volunteers from town and from Sorrow Hill worked side by side, raising timber frames and laying foundation stones. Yale Crawford directed the construction, his children playing nearby. Edmund arrived with his medical bag to tend to minor injuries, splinters, and strained backs. Xavier climbed the roof to help with the ridge beam, singing something cheerful in French. Hazel stood beside the foundation, holding architectural plans, issuing instructions with the authority of a general commanding troops. When she saw Rosalind and Dakota approaching, she waved them over. "First day of your new life," she said to Rosalind. "Ready to build something." Rosalind looked at the rising structure, at the people working together, at Dakota standing beside her. She thought of the terrified woman who had climbed off that stage weeks ago, clutching a fraudulent advertisement and a threadbare carpet bag. That woman didn't exist anymore. This woman, the one who had fought through fire and flood, who had faced down killers and saved lives, this woman was ready for anything. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." Dakota's hand found hers briefly squeezed once, with gentle firmness, and then released. A promise without words. A commitment to stand together, to build together, to face whatever came next, side by side. The prairie stretched around them, vast and wild and beautiful in its harsh way. The wind carried the smell of sage and distance and possibility. The White River kept flowing, its waters clear and steady, bearing witness to all that had passed and all that would come. Rosalind picked up a hammer and joined the others in their work. Beside her, Dakota lifted a timber beam with his good arm, settling it into place with practiced ease. Above them, the morning sun climbed higher, painting the world in shades of gold. The story was over. The ring was broken. The guilty had faced justice. The innocent had been freed. And here in this dusty frontier town beside a river that had seen both terror and triumph, two survivors had found something more precious than gold or land or power. They had found home.